Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for being part of our community. My name is Valen Kolika, and I'll be your host for today. Just a few reminders before we start. If you are, excuse me, if you have issues viewing the stream at any time during the presentation, and you're using the web browser version of Teams, that is, please refresh your browser. And if you're using the desktop version of Teams, please exit and rejoin. This simply just resolves some of the connection issues with our platform here. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared publicly. We will post the recording on our community at aka.ms/security-webinars. Closed captions in several languages are available during the live broadcast, and you can enable them by clicking on the CC button located on the lower right corner of your screen. Feel free to ask questions at any time by typing them in the live event Q&A window by clicking on the Ask a Question button. Please be aware that any questions you post will be publicly visible. However, if you prefer, you can post your question anonymously by checking the box right below where you enter it. Now, we often get many questions on these webinars, and we will do our best to respond to all of them in real time. In the event, if the answer was not provided, or if you may have additional questions post this event, please don't hesitate to raise them on our Azure Sentinel forum at aka.ms/Azure Sentinel community. We love to hear your feedback on how we can improve on these webinars, and you can do so by going to aka.ms/security webinars feedback. And by the way, all the links that I'm announcing here have been already shared with you on the chat or the live event Q&A window. I would also like to invite you to join our public community by visiting aka.ms/security community. That's the best way to ensure that you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements. On our community, you can speak directly to our engineering teams that create our security products. You'll be able to influence our product designs and get early access to changes by doing things like simply participating in private reviews, which, by the way, you can sign up for at aka.ms/security-prp. In there, you can request features, give feedback, review our product roadmaps, register for events, or join on webinars like this. We believe that the best way to improve our products is by removing any barriers between you and the people that create them. So we hope you'll join us. In today's session, Pete, Bryan, and Tiander Turpijn will take us through the Streamlining Your SOC Workflow with Automated Notebooks. Pete is a senior software engineer, whereas Tiander a senior program manager, both of them with our Azure Sentinel team. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to them. Pete, Tiander, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. And thanks for joining us, everyone. Let me just move this on. So today we're going to be talking, as Valen said, about automating your SOC processes and using notebooks to drive that. The reason for doing this is to help you improve the efficiency and effectiveness of SOC operations and tackle some of the common challenges that SOC team has. So during the course of the presentation, you're going to hear a bit from me, a bit from Tiander, and we're just going to be having a bit of a conversation as we go, bring up some of your questions that you're posting in the chat and just discuss them. So if you do have questions at any stage, please post them. We'll try and keep an eye on it and bring them into the conversation as we go. We want it to try and be as interactive as possible. So we're going to cover a few things today, starting off with what challenges we're trying to tackle. And then we're going to look at this concept of software-defined monitoring we've developed. And then we're going to look at the technical solutions for implementing that using notebooks. We've got a bit of a demo, a live demo of a notebook, which is always risky, but hopefully that will go well. But that will just highlight and show in a real scenario how this can all fit together. And then we're going to look at how you can kind of implement this yourself. So there's a few different things we're going to cover today. It's quite a lot to cover in the time, but there's going to be some more resources that we're going to reference as we go. and we're going to be publishing some more resources to help you with the deployment phase later this week. So you'll hear about that at the end, but just be aware that this webinar and its content aren't the only thing that you're going to need to rely on if you want to kind of catch up with this sort of process. So with that, I'll hand over to Tiander to talk about the kind of some of the challenges we're trying to address with this solution.
Yep, thanks, Ben. So there are, as you probably painfully are aware of, currently SOC challenges. So the Security Operations Center that you might be working on today or planning to start, planning to configure, there are challenges that are arising. And one of the biggest challenges is how do you keep up with the data that's being sent to your SIM? How does your SOC team cope with that amount of data? A lot of data, looking at IoT coming in or is already part of your potentially your SOC and your SIM. How do you keep up? And there's another challenge, right? The human factor is, how do you keep up with knowledge? If you are a SOC analyst attending this call, a SOC engineer, a SOC manager, maybe a CISO, right? How do you retain your SOC team, and how do you skill them up to the current challenges? Because the challenges are really there. And then the third one, maybe, and we have our own security stack. We have a Defender solutions, but many sources that your SOC team is using. Maybe those sources are bringing in valuable security data. Maybe those sources are giving you monitoring data. And how do you kind of tie those together, right? Those are generic kind of SOC challenges. And then if you are coping with that, how do you kind of prioritize the things that you need to investigate and triage? Because typically a SOC team is being overwhelmed with the number of data points, the number of alerts coming in. So it would be kind of great that if you can have kind of automation in place, which does a little bit of, and maybe more than a little bit, of giving you the right context, the right confidence in what it is that you're seeing, really needs kind of investigation or triaging that alert or that notable event, or maybe the incident that comes out of a notable event alert and then converts into an incident. And these are all kind of aspects of a modern SOC when you look at it. And of course, we from Microsoft running Azure Sentinel are trying to help ourselves, but also you as a customer to cope with those challenges. So if we move ahead to the next slide, you can see that we have a great kind of quote in there that a spokesman of a company which was confronted with a security breach where customer records were kind of stolen, that they were kind of looking back, right? What could we have done differently? Based on the aspects that I mentioned, how do you triage? How do you kind of, what kind of weight are you using to look at certain notable events, alerts, symptoms? And if you look at advanced persistent attacks that might have been there for a year or maybe longer, how do you make those decisions? And what kind of judgments did you take, or potentially will take differently if there's a new kind of rise of a new threat? So on the next slide, we will talk about the different kind of percentages that we typically see with customers. So this was a research that was done, and we do see the same thing, right? I already mentioned a high percentage of security teams that every day the SOC analyst looks at a huge list of alerts. So which one do I take first? Which one is high priority? Which one is affecting kind of resources that are important? Maybe your VIP resources, so your CIO, you need to protect him or her better. So you will typically, as a SOC team, have different weights on alerts that you are triaging, but that comes with a price, right? If you need to do it manually and you are facing a large number of alerts, there's going to be a human effect, which is we can't keep up. So we had an interview with a customer, and he shared in confidence, obviously, a very kind of painful and concerning fact with us. And he said, our SOC team cannot keep up with those alerts. So what we typically do, we dismiss those alerts. So we close them. And if they pop up again, yeah, then we consider them a little bit more important, and we tend to look at those events that resurface, because potentially there's something that we need to look at, right? Which is a concerning observation and a concerning thing that the customer shared with us. So from our Azure Sentinel, we're trying obviously to address that and have kind of automation in place and all kind of context enrichment, all kinds of threat intelligence capability, machine learning fusion. I'm just calling out a couple of aspects of a modern kind of cloud SIEM tool, which you will need to address this. And then I talked about the human aspect, right? If you keep overloading your SOC teams, there will be a certain point where you will have a kind of a substantial turnover if it comes to your SOC team. So this webinar that Pete and I are driving are specifically also intended to kind of lower the bar for you as a SOC analyst, engineer, or SOC manager to really take a look at notebooks, what we can do with notebooks to address all these challenges in an automated fashion, or manually invoking a notebook to help you with triaging and prioritizing, and then eventually closing that incident, resolving the incident, I should say, instead of closing it. And that's what we typically are aiming for. So Pete, you want to talk about the next slide? So you probably are aware of software-defined networking, right? And there's a notion called software-defined monitor, where we look at processes. Oh, here you are. Pete, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Too many mute buttons with these microphones, as always. Yeah, so thanks, Tiander.
Sure.
Yeah, we came up with this concept of software-defined monitoring to kind of address what we're seeing in those challenges Tiander talked about, particularly this idea that we've got good at detecting, from a technical point of view, activity. We've got good at creating alerts for activity. You look at pretty much every major security incident that's kind of been in the news over the last year, there have been alerts and indications from technology that this activity was going on. What differentiated the incidents that had a large impact versus the ones that were controlled early was what the process was when that was alerted, what the human analyst did, whether they investigated it thoroughly enough, whether they followed processes effectively enough. So what we're trying to do is look at how can we standardize that process, not fully remove the human aspect, because the human aspect is still vital in security investigations, but how can we use software to define processes, provide guardrails, and ultimately kind of drive quality in security analysis. So we came up with this concept. Kind of what does it mean? As Tiander kind of alluded to, stealing from the idea of software-defined networking, what we're saying here is that we should use software to define and template monitoring practices so that they can be used consistently to drive performance and quality within a organization. So high level, that's kind of what we're talking about, but really, what does this mean in reality? It means a process kind of like this. So what we're saying is that you take your expert knowledge, whether that be in-house research teams, work external vendors like the Mystic team here at Microsoft do, and you combine it with internal processes. So these are your technical detection elements. So how to find a particular type of activity with your internal process of, say, raising things in a ticketing system, coordinating with other teams, alerting relevant parties. You define that in software, you store that in a pattern, and then that pattern gets stored in a system whereby analysts can access it. And effectively that pattern store becomes your kind of set of playbooks about what to do in each scenario. But rather than it being a set of documentation to follow, it's all defined in software. So it's a case of, rather than reading through it and following it, it's a case of executing it. Tiander, do you want to talk about the kind of execution options here?
Yeah, so typically, and I'm pretty much addressing the SOC team here in this call, right? You have to forgive me by doing that, because I feel that there could be a lot of more advantages if a SOC team would look at notebooks, and where it specifically comes very valuable is the analyst leveraging an automated execution, which we will discuss in a couple of slides, but also manual execution. And we will talk about workbooks, notebooks, playbooks, the whole landscape. But this is extremely valuable for the analyst who can leverage automated execution to get enrichment that goes beyond what we are currently doing within Azure Sentinel, but also being able to manually execute those and customize those, right? And Pete talked about the patterns and the store that we have and the detection engineering that we do. But this is also for you to own and drive and manage and update based on your typical SOC team. So forgive me if I'm going to emphasize it each and every time, but I think that every SOC team, and specifically if you are using Azure and Azure Sentinel, you should look at notebooks. So forgive me the shameless plug, but this is really kind of a hidden treasure that I sometimes find talking to customers. Thanks, Pete.
Yeah, I think one of the really cool things about this idea as well is that you build a constant feedback loop between your analysts. And what typically happens in a SOC, or what often happens, is that analysts build up knowledge as they triage incidents. They'll learn about those particular systems, those teams, those user accounts that maybe do odd things that appear suspicious but are benign. But storing and reusing that data is very hard. You can maybe record it in like internal documentation, but then finding that each time is difficult and slow. Whereas with these pattern stores, you can build that straight back in. You can build the links and the knowledge into the patterns. So one of the metrics that Tiander talked about earlier was that staff turnover and the churn SOC teams have. That leads to so much organizational knowledge, and unless you're capturing that effectively, you're constantly going to have to be kind of learning the same things over and over. And these patterns are a great way of doing that, because a new analyst can come in, they don't need to necessarily look up what they should do or steps to follow. They can just take the pattern, they can just execute it in order. It's got all of that kind of contextual knowledge built into it already that they can see, but don't have to manually invoke. They just got it there in front of them, and then they can move forward. So from a quality of life aspect and a kind of speed to onboarding aspect, this model can really kind of benefit a SOC team and a SOC analyst as well. So as Tiander alluded to, notebooks are kind of key to this whole process. When we talk about patterns in that process, really what we're talking about with Sentinel is notebooks. This is the way to do it. And one of the questions we often get asked is kind of where do notebooks fit into the Sentinel ecosystem, and particularly with playbook and workbooks. And really, the reason notebooks are so good for this patternized approach is because they can do everything. So playbooks are good at many things, but really they're driven for a single repeatable task. You can chain a few tasks together, but really you're not going to kind of build a super complex workflow in that. They're also good for integrating with external systems. So if you want to kind of integrate with a third-party API, Playbook can be great for that. Workbooks, on the other hand, don't really have that same repeatable element, but they're very good at representing Sentinel data, presenting it in a high-level view and giving you that kind of visualization of it. But they can't bring in external data. Playbooks can kind of do that, but then you don't get the same visualization or view that a workbook would give you with that. You're kind of limited in necessarily what you can do. However, notebooks can kind of do all of that. They can bring in Sentinel data. They can present it in interesting ways with unique visualizations and drill downs, just like workbooks can. But they can also bring in external data. They also provide a document of what you're doing. So whereby a kind of a playbook has an execution log or a workbook has the data behind it, it's not necessarily giving you evidence of what's happened. Whereas in a notebook, every time you execute it, you can save the executed version, and that's your kind of evidence of here's what happened, here's what an analyst did, here's what they found. So it's got that input and output at every stage. So for postmortems or driving SOC improvements, having an analysis of what someone did in a documented way is really useful. But really, the kind of big thing about notebooks that differentiates it from the workbooks and playbooks is you can build a really big, complex chain of repeatable tasks. So you can build out an entire process within a notebook. You could potentially do that in a playbook, but it's going to get very complicated very quickly and probably going to kind of be quite clunky. It's also going to make it a little bit difficult to kind of process the output, whereas a notebook kind of has all of that. It's got that integration. Oh, sorry, Tiander.
Hey, Pete, a question. So looking at the slide, right, I see the word data a lot. So is notebooks also going to help me with kind of reducing kind of the avalanche of data that I need to look at? Because in the introduction, we also mentioned there's a lot of data coming into your SOC, right? Can we leverage notebooks to reduce that amount of data that we need to look at?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess there's kind of two ways of doing that. One is by integrating with other, like say, external data sources, you can start filtering down on your data sources in an automated way. One of the common ways we do that in notebooks is, say, taking a bunch of data and then comparing it against a broad set of external threat intelligence providers to kind of help us filter. The other thing you can do is, because notebooks can easily integrate with this external data sources, you don't, if you've got a very busy, noisy data source that you don't need for, say, alerting purposes, you can have that externally, and then simply when you need it as part of an investigation, you can query it dynamically as part of the notebook. So rather than having to bring all of that data into a centralized location, you can have it as kind of an ad hoc on-call element to support an investigation. And really that can be quite helpful for a number of reasons. It could be compliance. You need to keep the data in a particular location, on premise perhaps, but also just for data sources. Some are very useful as part of a forensic investigation, but not very useful for part of a alert and detection process. So being able to separate those kind of data sets out could be really useful. And
right.
Again,
so the integration with external systems that could be kind of a variety of data sources, but also maybe kind of threats, indicators of compromise, or any data stores that we could use to kind of enrich that the stuff that we already have, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel, right?
Exactly, and it doesn't have to be security data. One good use case could be like a change management system. Someone's made a change or performed an action in Azure on a resource. You want to see whether that was expected or permitted. Let's correlate that against the change management system. Did that user have a valid change ticket for that resource at that time? You wouldn't want to bring all of that change management data into something like Sentinel. It would be kind of a bit awkward and clunky, but calling that in a notebook makes complete sense and provides that kind of valuable context.
Yeah, I've heard a customer asking about, hey, do you guys integrate with do you have a CMDB? So the conversation was, what would you like to kind of query or pull in from that CMDB? And this is where a notebook probably is also going to be valuable, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great, thanks.
The kind of final piece of the notebook puzzle, which for me is really big, is this custom analysis piece. So whereas a playbook or a workbook tend to be something you would create at a team or organization level, a notebook can be quite individual. So you start from this patternized template, but as your investigation changes and goes in new directions, an analyst can customize it, they can add to it, they can tweak it, but they can do all of that without it affecting the pattern for next time. So the next analyst could still pick it up from the same patternized place, but you've got this customized workflow that is specific to an investigation in that notebook that the analyst has been able to leverage and again is documented for future use. And that customized analysis, it takes a little bit of learning from an analyst, like being able to use Python is generally a skill that takes a little bit of time for an analyst to learn, but it's incredibly powerful. There's so much you can do in notebooks, from data analysis to visualizations to machine learning models. So having that kind of skill set in your armory is incredibly powerful for an analyst. So what does that look like if you take a notebook, and which we've identified as being ideal for this scenario, and apply it to that high level workflow we saw before? Kind of what might it look like? So here we kind of have a workflow. An alert is raised, or in a Sentinel it would be an incident, and then what happens is the analyst can go to the notebook pattern store and pull a notebook that's relevant for that incident. And you could have patterns based off a number of things. It could be the source of the incident, it could be the type of the incident, it could be the business unit. Like, there could be a number of different ways you could split up these patterns. But they take the pattern, they run it, and that notebook does a whole bunch of things. It does the analysis steps, it enriches with TI, maybe adds context from your CMDB, all of those things we talked about. The analyst can then review the notebook and the data within it to determine what they're going to do with the incident. Do they need to triage it? Is it a false positive? Does it need to be escalated? If it is escalated, the great thing is when they're handing off to the, say, higher tier in the SOC or the incident response team, the briefing they can give can really just be the notebook. It contains all of that data. It contains all the steps they've done. If the IR team want to see what the initial triage was, well, it's right there in the notebook. If they want to see what the original alert was, well, it's right there in the notebook. So it's a really handy and useful document for passing between teams. And then once the IR process is complete and you're wrapping up, doing your post-incident review, well, you've kind of got your record of what's done there already. Store that notebook, put it in with some contextual information and some other notes, and that's your record for next time. You can also go through that, identify as a SOC team, identify other things that you might need to add to the pattern, improvements, things that could have been done quicker, things that have been missed. Again, you've got that record, so it's really good for doing that analysis of, hey, we should have done this, or hey, if I just looked at this first, I could have saved myself a load of time. So really useful for that kind of feedback, driving improvements across the org. So got a bit of a demo now where we're going to kind of look at that in reality. So notebook demo is always risky. I'm going to try a live one. If it doesn't work, I've got a completed one we can look at. Curse of the demo always seems to strike, but we'll give it a go. For those of you who aren't familiar, this is Azure Machine Learning. This is the environment where we execute notebooks in Azure Sentinel. So if you've ever clicked on a notebook within the Sentinel blade, it takes you through to Azure ML to execute. And here we have a notebook that is designed for, it's just a simple kind of incident triage notebook. So an example of a pattern that we've created that an analyst would pick up and run. So imagine we're a security analyst. We've been given an incident. We need to go look at it. We can come in and run our cells in our notebook. We don't have to do anything other than click run here. We need to put in our incident details here. We manually populated them here, but we'll talk about later how we could kind of automatically pass these elements through to populate this, so you wouldn't have to manually add it. We connect up to our Sentinel instance. A second. Great. So we're now connected to Sentinel. Again, I've not had to do anything here as an analyst except click some buttons. So there's no kind of skill element going on. Here we're just loading various aspects of what we're going to use later. So for those who aren't familiar or weren't here last week, we use Mystic Pi as our library for driving a lot of these notebooks. So what we're doing here is loading a lot of features of Mystic Pi, things like TI lookups and notebooklets that will provide us value later. But again, because this is all in a pattern, I don't have to do anything. So the first thing I get as part of my instant triage notebook is all of the entities that are attached to the incident. So I kind of just want to know what is this incident related to. And again, here's my big list of all the IP addresses, URLs, accounts, files, hashes. Okay, so we've got those. What do I do with them? Well, the first thing we can do is say, let's see if any of those appear in threat intelligence feeds. So what I'm going to do here in this cell is take all of those indicators and look them up against some external threat intelligence providers. So things like IBM's X-Force, Grey Noise, Alien Vault OTX. We could have others in here. So if you've got your, if you're a Virus Total subscriber, say, that could be in here, or pretty much any other threat intelligence feed you had. That includes the Azure Sentinel threat intelligence feeds as well. We could integrate with that. But what I get, it takes a little while to run because we're querying APIs. But what I'm doing here is basically saying, I've got all those entities. Do I need to worry about them? And here what I had is each of those entities. This is the original incident. Here are all the entities, and here's what threat intelligence says. So I can instantly see that, okay, one of the IP addresses that is linked to this incident, it's got a high severity result in OTX. I can see it's linked with a whole bunch of things. Most of the other things are okay. Another IP address that I should probably worry about here. But that's about it. So now, just by running and clicking those buttons, I've instantly kind of drilled down and said, okay, there is potentially some risk here. There's two particular IP addresses I need to kind of focus in on and see if there's any further kind of analysis I want to do. So what I can also do is then take each of those entity types and look a bit deeper. So here, what I'm doing is taking all of those IPs and getting some basic information about them. So who is information? Where in the world are those IP addresses located? Are they associated with any other alerts in my Sentinel instance? Passive DNS results? Are they part of a known VPS provider? Kind of all of that kind of contextual knowledge that an analyst needs is provided to me, and I just get it in the output here. It's dynamically loading, hence why it's jumping around a little bit. Once it's kind of done all of them, it will stop. But this is the sort of thing that an analyst would do as part of their investigation normally, but by templating it in this way, we've made it much easier to run. We've created a record of it, and we've ensured that the analyst does do it as part of their process steps. They can't skip this. They're not going to skip an IP address because they think it's familiar, right? Like you could see one of these IP addresses and think, oh, that's one of ours, it's okay, and maybe not do the proper analysis on it. Whereas in actual fact, they've just made a mistake. One of the octets is different, and actually it's a malicious IP. But here, I've got all of the records. I've got the passive DNS, the whois for each one of these. So I can go in and see that one with a high result. Let's find the right cursor. This high result from Virus Total. Here's information. It's an Akamai IP address. I've got everything about the ASN. Here I'm using virus total for additional details. Again, other ones I've got here, coming from Germany this time. Again, a couple of hits in OTX and virus total. So I can instantly tell that this alert probably isn't a false positive. There's kind of enough information just from that. But I can also look at all of the other entities as well. So not just IP addresses, here we've got domain names. All of those domain names attached to, or domain names or URLs attached to that instance. Let's look at the domain name. Who does it belong to? Is it well known? Here we've got things like apache.org. Probably okay, but yes, it's actually registered to the Apache Software Foundation. It's got a decent PageRank score. Again, I know straight away that these are probably something I don't need to worry about. Whereas if I saw that actually this was apache.org, but maybe someone had done some typo squatting and it was slightly mistyped, and maybe it was registered with GoDaddy and had a poor page rank, that would immediately kind of flag up as, hey, this is maybe not legitimate. And again, by putting it in this notebook pattern, I made this a lot easier for me to do, a lot quicker, and I've got that record and step for it. Same with account. So here, instead of using external information, as we did with IP address and URL to look at some interesting information, what we're doing is just querying different tables in our Sentinel instance to say, tell me a bit more about this account. What has it done? What's it related to? And here we get a review, so we can see what computers this account has logged onto, what IP addresses it's tried from. We can see that it's tried to log on to 2 computers and it's failed both times from the same IP address, and when this activity occurred. So again, I've instantly got some context about this account. I've got a few hosts that I might want to kind of pivot to as part of my investigation, and I've got all this here. Do the same for the host. There's a host attached to this instance. By running this, I can see straight away that, oh, it's an Azure compute instance. I can see what resource group it's in. I can see where it's located in the world. I can see what packages it's got installed on it. Again, all useful context that can quickly help me narrow this down. And again, you can customize this to say, based maybe on the resource group or the subscription, automatically raise a ticket or raise a contact with a particular business unit to pass that off if you've got like separated SOCs, or to query a certain CMDB to get some more information about this from another source. Here what we're showing is an example, but you can customize all of this.
Hey, Pete, question.
Yeah.
There's a lot of data in here and a lot of information. But if I'm new to this, right, new to Jupyter, new to notebooks, do I have to create this myself? And how much Python knowledge do I actually need to kind of use this in my SOC? Because I don't want to invest like a 3 months for each and every SOC analyst that I have. How can I get them up and running really fast?
It's a good question. And the great thing is, to use the notebook, you don't really need any skill. You've seen what I've done here. All I've done really is gone through and click the play or run cell button each time. So to consume a notebook, that's all the skill you need. If you can click a button, you can use it. Creating them does require a bit of skill. Now, obviously, at Microsoft, we've created a whole bunch of notebooks to help you with it. So you can take a whole bunch of off-the-shelf notebooks that are designed to meet common security scenarios like instant triage or host investigation, and you can just click that run cell button. If you want to customize it or create your own kind of pattern from scratch for your own specific process, yes, you're going to need a bit of Python skill. But again, by using this process of software-defined monitoring, the idea is not that every analyst creates these or needs to know how to create them. You can have an engineering team who can create them based off input from analysts and other experts. And then again, the analysts only need to be able to click the buttons. That's the great thing about it. Once it's created and the pattern's defined, button clicking is all you need to consume them.
Great, man. I wish I could run this automatically in my SOC, then I could get some sleep.
Well, how convenient. It's almost as if you knew what was coming next, Tiander. So yes, as Tiander was kind of alluding to there, the next step in this would be how do we remove that button clicking? The ideal scenario would be, rather than an incident occurring and an analyst having to pick up the pattern and manually run it and look at the output, what if that output was there for them when they came to triage the incident? And we've developed a kind of proof of concept solution to help with this. So what this is intending to do is create a process whereby every incident that comes in, or a subset of incidents if we want, automatically gets processed by a worker system. It will run a notebook, a triage notebook like the one you just saw, against all of those incidents, store it in Azure ML for us, and then put a link to that into Azure Sentinel. So what happens is the analyst can come into Azure Sentinel, they'll see an incident like this, it will have a comment that says use this notebook, they click the notebook and they have the completed version of the notebook that we just saw sitting for them in Azure ML. So they don't even have to click the play button, they can just scroll through the output and look at what was created each time. So this is really designed to kind of cut out any human interaction with the notebook if they want. You can also take it a step further if you don't want to even look at Azure Machine Learning and that notebook environment. You could save these notebooks as a static, say, HTML PDF file. So all you would need to do in that case is open the PDF, look at the output. So really what we're doing is streamlining that whole process, taking it one step further. So rather than even having to see a notebook at all, they just get the analysis output from it.
So hold on, Pete, and I don't want to sound cheesy here, right? But I just want to do a reality check. So you're saying that if I select certain incidents or any incident, depending on how my SOC team works, I could have this run automatically and give it to my SOC analyst as kind of evidence or something to go through to determine whether this is kind of an incident that needs an escalation or further investigation. So that analyst doesn't need to know Python or doesn't need to know about the machine learning, the ML workspace. What is that, by the way? But we can talk about that. But so I can give this to my SOC analyst, right?
Absolutely, yeah. All they need to be able to do in this case is just be able to read the output, and the output is really what you define it. So you can create it in a way that is most useful for your analysts. And again, the obvious use case for this is taking an incident and those first 10 things that you do with pretty much every incident as you're triaging it. Look at the entities, look at what they've done, look at any connected events. Well, you could template all of that in your pattern, have it run automatically, and the analyst can just pick it up and look at it. The other thing we could do is we can change the incident as well. So we saw there in the demo that I ran, we were looking at those entities attached to an incident and their TI severity in those external sources. Well, based off the feedback of that, we could do things like change the severity of the incident in Sentinel to give it a high priority. Based off other elements, you could assign it to specific analysts. So you can also kind of tweak that incident workflow in Sentinel based off the findings of these notebooks, and you could do that all automatically.
So you mentioned a couple of times patterns, right, in the slide as well, and you just mentioned it. What's the definition of a pattern? Because we talked about software-defined X. Is it some kind of framework that you're referencing? What do you mean by pattern?
So in this case, a pattern would be a notebook. So you're effectively, you would create a template notebook for your scenario, so your instant triage, and that would be your pattern.
So if I would kind of take my SOC team to the next level, I could work on certain patterns which will kind of guide me into investigations. How should I investigate an Office 365 incident, right? Is that what you also? Okay.
So if we go back to the architecture, so effectively what we're saying here is, let's get some of these, see if this works. Can you see that laser pointer?
Yep, I can see that.
So we have our Sentinel instance. An alert gets raised in there. We have a VM that is effectively like our controller VM. It gets those instant details on a scheduled task, processes them up into a notebook, and then from there runs that instant triage notebook we just saw. So in this architecture diagram, we're presuming there's a single notebook, that instant triage. But what you could do is you could create multiple patterns based on whether the alert is, say, from Office 365 or Azure Security Center, or whether the alert contains a particular entity. Let's say it contains an entity relating to like a VIP user. You might have one a slightly different workflow. So you could have multiple notebooks here. And what happens when the incident comes in, that worker VM selects the most relevant incident, the most relevant pattern, sorry, out of those notebooks, executes that. So you could, whilst this is kind of a simplified architecture, you could expand this out and have a whole range of different notebooks for different scenarios that get executed depending on certain criteria.
So if I'm a CISO or a SOC manager and I'm constrained by budget, right? That's one of the challenges for a modern SOC. I don't have to send my whole analyst team to a deep Python training and hire a truck full of developers to create those notebooks. You can use this approach, right? This architecture.
Absolutely. And in this approach, yes, it's probably handy to have someone with some Python knowledge, but it certainly doesn't need to be everyone. And again, the level of Python skill required is really defined by what you want to do. If you feel that your kind of current skill set is maybe not that advanced, well, you don't have to create really complicated notebooks. You could do something really powerful quite simply. Obviously, if you want to then maybe take advantage of the machine learning capabilities of Python or advanced visualizations, you might need some more advanced skills, but you certainly don't need that to gain a benefit from this solution.
Great. Because that's the biggest, I think, the biggest hesitation that SOC managers have. Do I need to send my analyst on a dev course, or do I need to hire developers? Okay, this is great.
The other good thing about this solution is, particularly if we go to this, the analysts, when they view the output, they see the notebook. So again, even if they didn't create the notebook, they can see what's happening. So you're learning as you're going through and using these notebooks, because you see the code that's written there as part of that.
Right. Great.
Get rid of this laser pointer. So I know, Tiander, you were saying one of the questions that you hear quite a lot is about kind of RBAC and compute needs for notebooks. So obviously automated notebooks is a little bit different. I don't know, did you want to kind of talk about the scenarios here?
Yeah, so always in a SOC and outside, specifically outside the SOC, outside your SIM, there are challenges always, and who gets access to what data, right? So if you are using Azure Sentinel today, you probably are struggling with that kind of organizational requirement. How do I delegate access to data? And obviously RBAC, role-based access control, as we know it in Azure, is also going to be important if you develop this and give it available, provide this to your SOC analyst. And that's the reason that we pretty much look at different tiers in the SOC. You typically have tier 1, tier 2, etc. And then you have the advanced kind of escalation level that you will do hunting. So it's really a security incident. You need to pay attention. There's a high risk, high impact, so you need to kind of hunt for it. And you can see here in kind of an RBAC model that we have in mind for you to explore, right? So Pete showed an awesome demo on the notebooks that you can also invoke in an automatic fashion. So an incident gets raised. It fulfills specific criteria, maybe the entities in there, there's a VIP computer or a VIP identity, and you want to invoke automatically those notebooks to do enrichment or other investigations to give the analyst more information, which helps decide whether he or she should raise that incident, escalate it, or resolve it. It's a false positive. So the automatic row that you can see where we typically position tier 1, tier 2, and this will vary in your organization, right? So that you will have read-only notebooks. So you don't have to, as Pete just mentioned, you don't have to run a cell because we are running it for you, and we will get the output and return it to you. So in the comments field, you can click on a hyperlink and that will give you. So that applies to the automatic tier 1, tier 2. And then you have obviously the tier 3 and the hunters who need capability to interact with the notebook, because based on what they are seeing, kind of they need to make decisions whether they need to take a left or take a right and investigate kind of more investigations. So that would typically be in hunter or tier 3. And then you need to make a decision, and this depends on your SOC. And I don't want to use the maturity word in here because every SOC is different. Doesn't have to do anything with maturity, but it relates to somehow to how well defined is your SOC team, right? And then you might have kind of exceptions or maybe exception use cases that you want to be able to execute notebooks. Now, again, executing a notebook, as Pete showed, is just clicking on run the cell and you will get the output. But if you want to kind of customize it a little bit, then you obviously need kind of permissions to interact with that notebook. But again, that varies and is related to your how your SOC team is operating. And then you have to compute. So I can imagine that you're wondering, hey, how can I run a Jupyter notebook? How can I run an Azure notebook? Azure notebooks are Jupyter notebooks. So those are the same. The difference is that we run it on Azure. So we take care of the compute, the infrastructure, if you will. So that runs for you. And that comes with kind of, hey, do I need access to that compute level or not? Do I need to interact? Because effectively, it's only a virtual machine that we run for you, and we host the notebook on top of that, so you can run it. So look at it as a Jupyter server if you're familiar with that. It just runs. Now, to run it manually or to run it automatically, that is kind of different, right? And that depends, again, how your SOC team is equipped and how your SOC team is kind of designed. So hopefully we are addressing the RBAC and the compute here. In the session that we did last week, we talked about what is a workspace. So obviously Azure Sentinel runs on the log analytics workspace. Compute runs on a machine learning within the machine learning workspace. So that's kind of the container, if you will, where we host that Jupyter notebook. So hopefully that clarifies it a little bit.
So thanks, Tiander. I see there's a few questions in the chat about kind of what's needed for kind of creating these automated notebooks. So we've got a few minutes left, so I'll just quickly cover this. The first thing to know is there's a blog that's going to come out this week, which details all of this in a lot more detail. But for this this kind of solution, it's very early stages, so there's a little bit of kind of manual deployment required. But really, it's not a lot. You need to deploy an Azure ML workspace, an Azure IaaS VM, and then some notebooks onto that VM. So those notebooks are the patterns we talked about and are the kind of generic patterns we've created for you. So that includes that triage notebook that I ran as part of the demo. The blog that's going to come out We'll talk you through all the deployment steps. We've created things like ARM templates to make it a lot easier for deployment. So hopefully it's something that is quite straightforward to do. In terms of cost, it's pretty cheap. We're not talking about a large Azure VM or requiring a lot of compute. I think I run this in my own environment, and it costs me kind of $10 to $20 a month to run this. And this is capable of kind of scaling to a decent sized team. So cost-wise, it's not too expensive at all. As I said, the blog is coming out this week on the tech community that will kind of cover all of this in a lot more detail. So the last thing I kind of want to talk about while we've got a few minutes is where to go from here. We've covered a lot of things, and if you're not a notebook user already, it probably might seem a little bit daunting. So the first thing to do is walk before you run. So get familiar with notebooks. Go to the notebook pane in Azure Sentinel. Create your ML workspace. It will guide you through that. We've got our Getting Started and Tour of CyberSec Features notebooks in there. Give them a run. They'll take you through the basics of notebooks, what they do, make sure your environment's all set up, show you what's possible. Just understand kind of how to execute a notebook in Azure ML. There's some guidance online. We've got some links in this deck that will be available for you. Just kind of get familiar with that before you even think about kind of creating these automated notebooks and the patterns for them. Once you've done that, you can start playing with notebooks a bit more, try our other notebooks that we've created for you around guided investigations and the alert triage ones. Then you can think about kind of customizing them and defining your own process, effectively turning them from these generic patterns we've created into something more specific for your organization. Then you can look at using that in your SOC processes, manually running that each time, making sure your users are familiar with how to run it. And then you can start thinking about that automated solution. I wouldn't say jump straight to the automated piece straight away. Make sure you kind of build it up. Obviously, if you're using notebooks already, you're familiar with them, the automated piece is there for you to go with. So go use it straight away. But certainly, I would not recommend starting at that point. These things are always kind of a learning process, and particularly for an analyst, if you're not used a notebook before, it is a little bit less familiar than what you would get in, say, the Sentinel UI. So you don't necessarily want to throw people into the deep end. Like I said, we got plenty of resources online, documentation, notebook samples, troubleshooting notebooks. You can also reach out to us. So on Twitter, we've got the Mystic Pi is the Python library. We've got an email for that, or obviously through any of your kind of Microsoft contacts. So lots of ways to reach out. And again, the tech community blog, when it's up, you can reply to that and add comments. All those usual communication channels. I know we're pretty much at time, but thank you for going through that with us. A lot of things there. I appreciate you might need to go back and have a look. So the recording will be available afterwards. And yeah, thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Pete and Tiander, first of all, for being our guest today and for this excellent presentation. If you don't mind just going to the last slide, that would be great. Perfect. Thank you. So just wanted to be, we're going to give another roundup here. I don't know if were we able to address the pattern question? There
we did talk about that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So at the same time, I just would like to remind the listeners that the best way to ensure that you don't miss any future webinars and major announcements, that is, please visit our landing page at aka.ms security community. In there, like we shared some of the resources here, you'll find the relevant resources for each of the security product that we support. And also a good start would be browsing our bite-sized product videos, the Ninja trainings, and even the recording of the past webinars, and as well as their relevant GitHub communities and more. Thank you so much for being our guests, and I want to thank all of you for being part of our community and for joining us on these webinars. We hope to see you next time. Goodbye.